Hello, and welcome to another Steer Your Career podcast. This one is a fun episode for me. I'm talking inside baseball about interviewing with Jeff Sipe. He has about 50,000 followers on LinkedIn. He has tons of fans on YouTube. This guy knows what he's talking about. He was a recruiter at Google for 5 years, interviewed program managers, technical program managers, software engineers, engineering managers. So this is going to be a great interview. We're talking shop about how to get into Google, how other companies interview, common interview mistakes. So enjoy this episode. Before I introduce you to Jeff, a couple of things. One, if you're looking to get a better job and you want a better job quickly, confidently, and with lots more money, that's what we do best at Kadima Careers. So go to our website at kadimacareers.com and we offer coaching, we offer community, we offer digital courses. So however you like to learn, we're there to help you. And before I hand you off to this interview with me and Jeff, the last 3 words I'll leave you with are own your career. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Steer Your Career podcast. I'm really excited to have a seasoned technical recruiter who has worked for 5+ years at Google, also done recruiting at lots of other companies. He's a technical recruiter. He is YouTube famous. I met him on LinkedIn, but a lot of clients of ours at Kadima have talked about Jeff's YouTube training. So Jeff knows what he's talking about. And Jeff, I'd love to introduce you to our sick career audience here. Tell the audience a little bit about who you are.
Thank you, first of all, Alan, so much for having me on. And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about myself. It's not really my thing. But yeah, I'm really fortunate. Basically, about 15 years of recruiting experience. My claim to fame is the 5 years at Google. And I've been coaching people now with my own business for about 6 years. And so I think actually that's where I've learned the most about a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. When you're in the business, you don't always have the time, but when you're working one-on-one with individuals, you just learn so much. And I'm so fortunate to have this amazing community around me, and yourself included. So just really excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And I was reading through your LinkedIn profile, and it's a well-written one, by the way, nicely done. But you said back in 2018, and you were actually specific with the date, October 9th, 2018, you were watching a YouTube video that had over 10 million views and was giving horrible job interview advice. I see this all the time on LinkedIn, all this snake oil being served all over the place. Do you recall what the bad piece of advice was, or what kind of irked you by watching this video that caused you to go into this whole different path?
Yeah, it was a video specifically about how to answer "Tell me about yourself," which again, we know that's probably the most Googled and looked up interview question out there. And it's understandable. It's a very confusing question, but just the advice in that video, it was literally every single thing that you wouldn't want to say to answer that question. My advice would be the exact opposite. And when I saw that, the funny story is I was living in Maui at the time, and it was a very windy day, and I lived by the ocean. And so I threw on a hat, went onto my lanai, and filmed a really terrible video. But I just wanted to start sharing because it was just an opportunity. You see so much bad advice out there and you think, wow, this is actually hurting people. And so many of the comments were so positive. Thank you so much. And I was thinking, oh no, this is not going to be good for these people. And if it had 10 million plus views, I don't know, it's a little scary.
Yeah. And that is, I believe, the most asked question. And we train our clients on that. You have to have that down and tight. Do you recall what the advice was that kind of irked you? And if you recall it all, but otherwise we can spend more time on how to answer this question properly.
Yeah, it was something about one of the pieces in there was saying, sometimes I like to try French in my spare time, but I'm not that good at it, or was something that was just so off-putting or would have been extremely off-putting. There were 2 or 3 instances of that were not clear and concise and would really have brought an interviewer down.
Yeah. I can understand that. So you've coached, I think, 2,500 folks or so, something crazy like that. And I'm sure you're coaching them on the TMAY, the Tell Me About Yourself. What are some pieces of advice that you give your clients on how to answer this the most popular question ever asked.
Yeah, and I always like to preface that with my lens is narrow and very specific. And I understand that not everybody likes my approach and agrees with my approach. So I'll always preface it that way. But for all common questions, there are two things I really like to focus in on. One is a rule of three. I think a rule of three works really well. And then for this type of question, 1 minute or less. Those are just my big recommendations. But for tell me about yourself, it's not walk me through your resume. It's tell me about yourself and why are you in the job interview? You're in the job interview to discuss why you're a fit for the role. So I always recommend that people identify three strengths that directly
Mm.
correlate with the position and they highlight those strengths. And then they end with, and of course, I'd be more than happy to walk you through my resume, or I'd
Mm.
be more than happy to walk you through my background. Some interviewers ask me, tell me about yourself to learn about the person. Some people want them to walk you through your resume, but go role specific and then default by backing it up with that question.
I like that. You don't overwhelm them. And we usually give guidance at 2 minutes, but 1 minute, 2 minutes, whatever. You don't want to be going on and on. When I was at Google, I had a candidate that was interviewing with me. It was a level 2 job, I think coming right out of college. His tell me about yourself, and it was a 30-minute hiring manager screen with me, was 17 minutes long. I was like, dude, what's going on here? It, so it would have been great if he had caught some of your YouTube videos before he bombed with me.
Yeah.
Although that was before you were doing your stuff, because that was in 2014 or 2015. So you were at Google then too, I think, or interviewing candidates. And what sort of candidates do you typically interview? I believe it was program managers and others, but what sort of roles did you typically source or recruit for?
My first 3 years was program managers and technical program managers. The following year was software engineers and eng managers. And then the last year was more like sales engineers, customer engineers. So any like client facing. And so the
Mhm.
last 2 years were Google Cloud. And then the first 3 years were all over the place.
Got it. Tell our audience a little bit of difference between the program manager and the PGM and the TPM. And Google calls it PGM. Most companies call it PM. But a program manager and a technical program manager, what do you look for differently between those two?
It's such a great question, Alan, because I think that sometimes people think that technical program managers are really technical. It's much more domain specific.
Hmm.
So you can be a technical program manager in a technical domain that you really could have learned on the job, whereas opposed to TPM software engineering, you're going to have to be really technical. Actually, the most interesting data point to discuss there is the salary differential between program managers and technical program managers. So I did
Yes.
that from 2013 to 2015, and there was about a 10% differential during that time. So TPMs would earn 10% more. Now it's more like 20 to 30% more than program managers. I've noticed a real shift, and that shift is significant. I help with salary negotiation, and I have seen some crazy TPM salaries at Google that just did not exist when I was recruiting those roles.
So I'm a program manager. It was one of my jobs I've had. I've managed program managers at Google. I also managed TPMs at Google. And I think the TPMs tended to be a little bit more technical. They might have had an eng background that were trying to become a SWE, a software engineer, and didn't get it. But I often found my program managers to be more effective at doing the job that they needed to do. But I agree that we would pay the TPMs more because they were more technical, and Google puts a lot of value on that. I think other companies put value on that as well.
Yeah.
And the interview process, how different was the interview process that you saw? Because I'll tell you how ours went, but what's the difference of someone interviewing for a TPM role at Google versus a PGM program manager role at Google?
At that time, it was a little different. They definitely were interviewing more. Candidates had to make it through more interviews, and they were less rigid on not over interviewing, which they are very rigid on that now. So sometimes my candidates would have a couple of technical base. They would be technical role related, but now it's more like maybe you get one of those instead of two or more of those. But they're usually like pretty similar to program managers. They're going to get the basic Google interviews, and then they're going to have that cross-functional interview as well. I've seen that be pretty consistent.
Cool. And you've recruited at other companies before Google. I don't know if after Google. What other recruiting experience have you had, first of all, and then talk a little bit about how Google is unique compared to those?
Yeah, I think I feel really fortunate, Alan, because I've really had a pretty diverse recruiting background. I've worked for big and small. So I started at Aerotech back in '05 in San Diego, and I was hiring like low level manufacturers, like in the manufacturing space. And then flash forward, like I didn't have another recruiting role for 3 or 4 years. And then I jumped all the way up to recruiting executives, and it was a really interesting role. I was recruiting executives who basically had been a president, a CEO, or a founder of a business, and now were at the capstone of their career and wanted to lead mastermind groups. And so I recruited those kinds of people, which was such an amazing experience because they taught me more during the process than I was teaching them, of course. And then I moved back into the agency world. Then I moved that was an agency startup. This is getting long. And then I moved into a corporate environment. It was a public company, small public company, about 400 million in revenue. And then to Google. And the biggest difference at Google is just the craziness of it. I joined when they were still asking trick questions and all that stuff. And I think that sometimes people get too nervous about the Google interviews. And Alan, one of the most interesting data points, and I'll kick this back to you, the comparison of it's tougher to get into Google than Harvard. That's actually not true because statistically, many less people actually apply to Harvard than apply at Google. But I think a lot of the reason why Google has this allure is because people make it a bigger thing maybe than it is. And then that creates the nerves and anxiety, which can make interviewing challenging.
Plus, at Harvard, you got to pay $250,000. And at Google, they pay you $250,000. So of course it's going to be harder to get into a company where they're going to be paying you all that money. I was actually having a conversation with someone about, does it look better to have Harvard on your resume or Google on your resume? I don't know if you have a thought on that. So you have Google on your resume. I have Google on my resume. Harvard wouldn't have sniffed at me. Do you think having a big corporate logo, from a recruiter perspective, when you were recruiting people, what were some attributes that would impress you or be key identifiers as you're looking through millions of applicants? Or you weren't looking through millions, but you were looking at hundreds and thousands of applicants. Google was sifting through the millions, but I don't think you would have had the time to look at a million.
It's definitely the corporate logo is way more valuable than the education logo. I always try to talk about this. People are having a lot of questions around, should I join big tech or not? Just all the cultural changes, the layoffs, but the value of those brands is priceless. And if they see Google or Meta or Amazon on your resume, you're likely to get a call because you're likely applying for, you've gotten in front of that role because you have similar experience at a killer company, and it's just always going to mean more. And even at Google, I think people are surprised to hear that I hired a lot of people who didn't even complete their bachelor's degree. Education to me, of course, Harvard's not bad. MIT's pretty good. Wharton's pretty good. Stanford's pretty good, right? But like I would always lean into the experience over the education, 100%.
Someone who actually did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Google, so I was always impressed with the structured interview process. They do fairly good job of calibration, I think, at Google versus most companies. I always found it interesting that there was not really an interview database, a question database, and different groups and different teams use different questions and different individuals use their own questions. And I can talk about how I chose mine. I'm curious from your perspective, did you see that also, that different teams would use different sets of questions, and how challenging, if at all, was that for you as a recruiter and also to prepare candidates for?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I've felt as though and still feel like structured interviewing in my mind is that every candidate gets the same questions.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And otherwise, you're introducing way too much bias into the process. And so I think it's an area where Google actually fails. And I found that having to constantly give feedback to my interviewers about the types of questions they asked and maybe the appropriateness of those questions could be challenging. I would say that I was very fortunate that I was very tough on my interviewers, but I always had the support of leadership to do it. And I was really tough on them, though. If they acted poorly, they were going to hear about it. Their manager was going to hear about it. Their skip lead was going to hear about it. People didn't always accept interviewing my candidates because they knew I was pretty tough.
What are some of the things that you would see good process at Google, and what were some of those things that were poor process when you would get on their asses?
The positives were, I think, just the warm and kindness of it. Like most Google interviewers back then were at least warm and kind, and that can really de-stress the candidate, and that's really helpful. That was probably the biggest positive piece I saw. Biggest negative piece was time to complete feedback, as I'm sure you experienced. I had an amazing opportunity to work with the VP in one of my product areas, and I was able to, with his help and a tremendous amount of help from others, reduce the interview feedback time, cut it in half for the entire org, which was hundreds of people. But I had to experience a lot of pain and poke quite a bit to get there because that org had one of the biggest lags. I think the average was like 6, 7, 8 business days to get interview
Wow.
feedback in.
Yeah.
I don't know what you experienced. You can tell me about it, but that was my experience.
I made good friends with a lot of recruiters at Google. One of the years I was there, I was hiring, I think, 40 or 60 people for my team. And some of them reported to me, some of them one level below, but I insisted on interviewing everybody. And I also required my team to get feedback in within one business day because I was like, I do not want to be the bottleneck here. So I won, they had an award, Hiring Hero, for each office. I got it for the New York office 3 quarters in a row. So the recruiters liked working with me, and my volume was crazy. But some recruiters did not like working with me because I would also hold recruiters to a high bar in terms of getting us a good, diverse set of candidates, which some recruiters were better at that than others.
100%.
So I have a good question for you on the Google interview. So Google traditionally interviews for 4 criteria: RRK, role-related knowledge, leadership, googliness, and GCA, general cognitive ability. I would always focus on GCA. That's just what I like doing. The googliness always was interesting to me, and I think every team had different interpretations of it. I would love to know what your interpretation is of googliness and how you saw that be assessed across the multiple teams and organizations you supported.
Yeah. So one of the biggest changes, Alan, that happened since we were there is that they combined that interview. And now I've seen them actually just as recently as the last 3 to 6 months separating them again. But it was always googliness and leadership, and then they made it googliness and leadership interview. The most interesting thing that's happened with that interview is how it's changed over time. And so 3 items that I've just recognized thematically over the last 2 or 3 years are it's leaned heavily into decision making. So now it's so heavily on like the decisions you make. And then the 2 pieces that are coupled with that is how do you make decisions that are collaborative and inclusive? And so if anybody can go in and lean into those 3 items in those interviews, typically they're going to do pretty well.
Interesting. So I see that come up in leadership, and it's hard to backwards engineer what's going on behind the scenes. And different teams I found would interview differently at Google. So my teams, we would have one person focus on each of the attributes. Some teams would have multiple people focus on multiple attributes. What are some of the core differences that you saw from Google, where most of your interview experience and preparation has been, versus when you prepare people for other companies outside of Google? What are the idiosyncrasies that you train or prepare people for Google? And which other companies have unique idiosyncrasies that you help support with? Or do you only coach for Google interviews?
I think I'm at like 100 different companies that I've coached for at this point. The 2 ones that are very nuanced and specific are Google and Amazon. So with Amazon, obviously, if people don't know, it's a behavioral shop. Unless you're going after a technical role, it's all behavioral questions, and anything else out there is fake data. It's all behavioral. Whereas Google tends to lean 50% behavioral, 50% hypothetical. And of course, if it's a technical role, you're going to get those technical questions. The biggest thing that I coach for, and like my claim to fame, is that I came up with my own method for answering hypothetical questions, because those are just scary. And by the way, it's crazy. People don't understand this, but almost all companies ask hypothetical questions. We'll ask you what would you do in X scenario? I want you to imagine. It's almost 100% that companies are going to ask you that type of question at least once throughout the interview process. And so that's where I really lean into the hypothetical side of things. They're tougher than behavioral answers, although people really struggle with their behavioral answers too, of course. But that's my claim to fame and where I've spent the vast majority of my time is really building a system that helps people answer those types of questions.
What sort of system do you do? I would love for you to share a little bit of that if you don't mind sharing some of your secret sauce with our
Oh, yeah.
sick audience here.
Yeah, and Alan, of course, like everything I'm going to talk about is on YouTube anyway, so it's all good. On the behavioral side, we have the STAR method. That's the method most people know: situation, task, actions, results. And that could be the PAR method or the CAR method. It's all about setting the context, sharing your actions, and sharing the results. On the hypothetical side, I created a method called CFAS. And so what CFAS is, it's clarify, framework, assumptions, solutions. And so basically the setup is it's BS. You get a hypothetical question and there's so many ambiguities that you need to clarify the question and ask follow-up questions. Now, the big key there is it's not like the real world. So in the real world, we ask open-ended questions to gather data. In an interview, we ask either or yes or no questions so they can instantly pick. What do you like better, pizza or burger? Okay, I like burgers better. Okay. So we make it really easy by providing data. Then just an outline. Here are the few items we're going to talk about. So you're setting the tone for the rest of your answer. I stole the framework piece from consulting firms. That's what they use when answering case study questions. It works really well.
Yep.
The secret sauce is the assumptions. Here's why. If I say, okay, I'd support this client by doing A, B, and C, it's like interviewers so disconnected. I'd support this flip-flop retailer that has online and brick and mortar stores and is looking to increase their ad sales or their revenue through ad sales by 10% by doing the following. Now they're actually picturing that flip-flop retailer. They're picturing growing it by 10% with Google Ads, and they're in the journey. So then when they solve, what I recommend is don't solve for everything. Solve for a couple framework concepts, then check in and say, hey, like we've solved for the goals and objectives and the historical data. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the risks next. How does that sound? So you're making it very collaborative, back and forth. You're building in visuals. It's a lot to throw at an audience to talk about CFAS, but I've coached this method thousands of times and it definitely works.
I love that. I love the framework. I don't like the fact that CFAS is a hard thing to pronounce. STAR is easier to pronounce, but we use CARL, which is context, action, result, and then L is learning because you often get probed with that. But CFAS I love, and the hypothetical ones are such a critical piece, not just at Google interviews. We call them hypothetical or subject matter expertise interviews where they're just probing on these areas. And I also really appreciate a couple of the tips that you've done multiple times here, Jeff, is to probe with the interviewer to make sure that you're not overwhelming them with too much information. So before you share the risks, which they may or may not be interested in, see if they're interested in that. And you also said that with the tell me about yourself, of give them a little taste and then say, check for them to see if they're with you or they just want ready to move on.
So, Alan, it's a really important data point that I don't see a lot of people talking about, but there is a personality type that I think people just need to be aware of. So some people are completionists. They're the type of people who, if they start a movie, they have to finish it, or they start a task, they have to finish it. And there's no challenge with that whatsoever. But some people come into their interviews and they say, I have 7 interview questions. I'm going to get through all my questions. And so when candidates get really long-winded and they just keep going on, when that person can't get to their agenda, that candidate instantly fails because they didn't allow the interviewer to get to their agenda. So I'm always trying to avoid trying to fight against this completionist person and just make sure that you allow them to get to their agenda. So if you say, hey, should we move on to risk? They say, you know what, I'm all set. Let's move on. Great. Let them move on.
Exactly. And it's important for you as an interviewee to be cognizant of the time you have. You won't be able to control the entire interview, but if you know you only have 45 minutes, if the interviewer wants to get their questions asked, which at companies like Google and Amazon, they need to, it's required as part of the interview feedback. But there are other situations where I've been part of, you've probably been part of, where the interviewer will just blab on and on. And in that case, I advise our clients just let them, because people are more positively inclined and they find themselves more interesting the more they talk themselves. So let the person talk. But at a Google or Amazon, be wary that you're not talking too much. And not only are you not talking too much, but make sure you're answering the question, which is something that I see people fumble on often. I don't know if you see that, where people are not answering the question asked.
Alan, it's a fantastic point. So let's actually cover both of those items because they're both so interesting. I always go back to like basics. So, like with allowing the other person to talk, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, like
Love the book. Yeah.
the basic, that's your foundational book. And in that book, what we know is when people talk about themselves, the more they talk, the more they like you. So I feel like that's such a critical piece of the puzzle there. And now the second piece, remind me of the second piece because I already forgot it.
Yeah. The second piece is answering the question.
Oh,
So, yeah, first off is like talking too long, but then also making sure you respond.
so here's what I believe. I think if the typical interview candidate who has to go through like a full slate of interviews, let's call that 3, 4, 5 interviews. I think that 99% of candidates are answering the wrong question or an adjacent question. It's so crazy to me. The one piece of interview advice I never see is hear the question, write it down, ask them to restate it if you need them to, then you restate it to clarify the question. Because so often I'll even take clients and I'll intentionally do this. I'll let them answer the wrong question. And then I'll say, restate the question I asked you. And they'll be like, oh, I can't do that. I'd say, that's a challenge. It's the most basic item, but if you Google it, can't find it anywhere. Nobody talks about actually making sure you've heard the right question. And so many candidates are actually answering the wrong question. I have a story about it that I'm willing to share if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, sure, please.
So many people know Waymo, Google's self-driving car division. This is my fun story. So I went to interview for a recruiter role over there, and that was in the Google X building in Mountain View at the time. And so first two interviews were literally the best interviews I've ever had in my life, period. Not even close. So the third interview was with the skip lead. It was the GCA interview. And of course, I was getting all excited. I was like, oh, GCA interview, I got this. She asked me the question. I jumped up to the whiteboard. I started solving. And 10 minutes in, I paused and I said, I'm sorry, can you restate the question? I was answering the wrong question. I looked at her and I said, I really would appreciate 5 minutes more to answer the right question. And I hope the first 10 minutes showed how I think and work through things. Got to the end results. Jeff, it was so close. It was laser thin. You came in second place. So I said, oh, yeah, of course. I answered the first GCA question wrong. And I knew it. And from then on, it was just a great reminder and something that I've coached all my clients on.
Yeah, and that's part of your CFAS, the clarification up front.
Yeah.
And then for those listening at home, GCA, again, like I said it before, but general cognitive ability. So where the interviewer is really trying to assess how you think through things. And it's less so about how many golf balls fit in the school bus. That Google used to do that, but now it's more, how would you increase ad spend by 10% on this website with limited budget, with a small budget? What other key tips, or like what other errors do you see people make, or fumbles that they have, that are just some common things that you can help people to fix right here?
Yeah, then the number one item that I spend the majority of my time coaching on is how. So, on the behavioral side, most people spend all their time talking about what they did, but they don't support the what with the hows. And then on the hypothetical side, excuse me, they just don't get enough depth into how they would do it. They say, oh, I'd talk with the design team, or I'd work with the engineers, or we'd talk to the client, but that's your what. So, what's supported by how? So, there's an interesting path that I've mentally created for myself, whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. But most of my coaching really is based in science and psychology. And so, if you tell somebody how you've done it or how you would do it, they start to picture you in the role and you become memorable. When you're memorable, you're more likable. When you're more likable, you're more hireable. And how is really the unlock, the piece of the puzzle that I've found that if you're not getting into that level of depth, if I can't picture how you've done it or how you would do it, I'm not going to remember you and therefore I'm not going to hire you. And that to me is the key piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's critical. And you mentioned before Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and or How to Win Friends and Influence People. I'm guessing that you're also a fan of Robert Cialdini's book on influence. Are you familiar with that one?
I don't think I am.
Okay, it's a good book. He talks about the 7 different factors that lead to influence, and one of them is liking. Another one is reciprocity, commitment, authority, and other things. But that's a good book also. And I do find that interviewing is really a lot of psychology because it's a very poor medium to really assess people. It's artificial. You have these like 45-minute chats, and then you move on to the next person and then the next person. And you're comparing them against 4 to 5 other people, and you have to make a very quick decision on the candidate.
It's so true. And then the other really interesting piece, and Alan, I'm going to have you send me that book. The concepts definitely sound familiar, but I've never read that book. I'm really losing my train of. Oh, okay. Maybe it does really look familiar.
It's a good book. And I was able to influence Dr. Cialdini to like actually sign it and send it to me, which was pretty cool.
When was it written?
It was written probably in the 1990s, but it's on whatever edition number. I don't know when it was written initially, but he came up with it. I don't know, but it's a good book. Over 5 million copies sold. He's using some of his tactics right there to give it authority. That's social proof.
Love it. I think the other piece that's really important to remember, like there's such a limited amount of time to win these people over. So I love the case studies, and the famous case study that's been done time and time again is there's the 45-minute interview where the interviewer gives the interview for the 45 minutes. And then they've done the case studies where they have a group of people review the first 3 seconds or 5 seconds of the interview. And they have a 90+% success rate of determining whether the interviewer liked and was going to hire that person. And so just coming in with that positive attitude, chin up, the smile, having great answers to common questions. Because the trick that people don't understand is if they like you right away, the science and psychology is that they're going to support your answers, even if you don't do great. But if they don't like you right away, they're going to use that as a way to poke at everything you say and do to be more on the negative side. It's like I spend all this time coaching and saying all these things, but none of it really matters. If the first seconds of the interview aren't positive, the data and science shows that the chances of your success are pretty low.
Yeah. We train our clients about the 4 phases of every interview, where part 1 is rapport building that rapport, smiling, connecting with something in common. Secondly, it's a tell me about yourself. Usually that's coming up. And to your point, there's ways to nail that or at least get it solid. Then the questions that they have for you. And those are very preparable, very beatable, using your framework, using the STAR technique, the Carl technique. And then the last part is questions that you have for the interviewer. Going back to the psychology, the primacy effect of the rapport building at the beginning and the recency effect at the end, those questions can also influence negatively or positively. I've actually seen them work more negatively when people ask crappy questions or don't have any questions. But your thoughts on questions at the end of the interview and how people should think about those?
I love this question. So this is my Dale Carnegie, right? So I have a very different approach. I coach people to not ask any questions about themselves. So I make all the questions about the audience. And again, I think I could even have somebody argue against this and be totally comfortable. I don't think it's perfect. Here are my 4 favorite questions. What do you love about the company? What do you love about your role? What do you love about your team? To the extent that you can share, what's the coolest thing you're working on right now? Love, cool, you're off the video. Oh, I love Jeff.
Yeah.
It's a psychological trick. And by the way, of course, if that's what the hiring manager and they're like, oh, the team sucks, this company's rough, like it gives you great insight, but they're talking all positive. The question that really just bums me out is, what are the biggest challenges I'm going to face in this role? Oh,
Yeah.
no, because it's like it drags me down. Love, I'm up, but really challenging and probing questions. I see some positives there, but I don't recommend them.
Yeah, I do like that. Less so about the company, but all of them are actually very interesting. And I do the positive aspect. And if the person can't respond with some positivity, that could be a yellow/red flag.
Yeah, yeah. What do
Awesome.
you, Alan? What do you like? What are the questions you like the most?
So my go-to questions are depending on what stage this is, but this is really good for the hiring manager. Compared to the other candidates that you're considering, where do you see my strengths? What potential concerns do you have that I could, or what concerns do you have that I could potentially address? So you won't always get a response there, but I find 50 to 75% of the time you will. And some people will just be like, I don't feel like sharing, or I haven't had enough people yet. But you'll find out who you're up against, and you'll get some really good feedback there. That's one I like. Another one I like is depending on if it's a backfill or a newly created role. If it's a backfill, what did the prior person do really well that you want me to continue? And what would you want that person to have changed or improve upon that you're looking for in this new role? And then the last question I always tell people to ask at every stage is, I'm really excited about this job at whatever company. What's the timing and the next steps? Because so many people leave the interview without knowing that, and then then the ball's not in your court. It doesn't mean that the recruiter or the hiring manager is going to actually adhere to that date. At least that gives you carte blanche to follow up then if you haven't heard back from them.
Love it. It's awesome.
Cool. This is a great conversation. I would love to keep going on, but we do need to wrap up. So, two last questions for you, Jeff. You've shared lots of amazing advice here. What's one last piece of sick career advice that you'd like to share with our audience today?
Let's do LinkedIn. I know it's the animal that nobody wants to talk about, but I love storytelling, right? So, usually as a YouTube creator and just people in the career space, they just don't listen to us about optimizing your LinkedIn profile. But the reason why we're chatting today is because I always made it a priority in my career, and I didn't go seeking the job at Google. Google sought me out. And I got the job at Google because I had a good LinkedIn profile, and it has equated to millions more dollars in my career. And people can hate talking about money, love talking about money, but that's just the reality. And so optimizing your LinkedIn profile, it is so easy. It takes no time. And I know people don't want to do it, but it's the one sneaky trick that it works for you while you're sleeping, taking walks on the beach, watching Netflix, whatever it might be. That's one data point that I always like to emphasize. My story is that I got my great job because of it. So I always like to push that.
I'm so in agreement here. I've been on LinkedIn for almost 21 years. I joined in April of 2004 when I found out about it in B school. Yeah, I'm not I guess I am a shareholder because I own Microsoft stock in the S&P funds that I have. But yeah, it is like getting a job is sales and marketing. And your best marketing asset is your website, and your website for a professional is LinkedIn. So again, I don't get a kickback. I would love to do an affiliate deal with LinkedIn because I recommend it so much, but they don't need my affiliate revenue. Or I could use theirs. They don't need me to. They basically have a monopoly on the space. Awesome. And on that note, how is the last question I have for you? How can people follow you? How can people learn more? I think I know the answers myself based on your advice there, and also based on how you started your career in this space. But how can people find you, support you, reach out to you?
Yeah, the best place to go, you literally can get to all aspects of my business, all my social media at practiceinterviews.com. And I think I got really lucky with that domain. I paid $1,000 for it back in the day, and I love that. But yeah, everything from my YouTube to my LinkedIn to my services, I have a lot of free resources on that site. So yeah, practiceinterviews.com is where you can find everything.
Awesome, Jeff. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on the Steer Your Career podcast, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much, Alan. I really appreciate it.
Bye, Jeff.